he's an expert in Judaism, that oral law came to be venerated even more than the written revelation, than the writings of Moses. And I'm reading now from his book, Volume 1, pages 33 and 34. He says, the distinction between the ordinances and decrees of the scribes and the biblical law, that is, the oral tradition and the biblical law, is constantly made in the juristic literature. But the authority of the scribes or the learned to make such regulations was not questioned, nor was the transgression or neglect of their rules a venial offense. On the contrary, a more serious matter is made of the words of the scribes than of the words of the written law. So says George Foot Moore in his monumental work. In other words, the oral traditions in the days of Christ were considered not only of equal authority as the Scriptures, but they were also, in many cases, considered to be higher than the authority of Scripture. Now, in our next study together, we're going to take a look at Mark chapter 7, and we're going to see how this idea, Jesus had to battle against it in the issue having to do with the washing of the hands. So you won't want to miss the living example of this concept in our next study together. Now, the Jews of Christ's day believed that the rabbis spoke with the voice of God. Dr. John Cunningham Geikie, in his very good book, which, this is an old book from over 100 years ago. It's called The Life and Words of Christ, had this to say about the veneration that the rabbis were held in the eyes of the Jews in the days of Christ. He says there, from their pupils, the rabbis demanded the most profound reverence. The honor, says the Talmud, due to a teacher borders on that due to God. Interesting. And then he continues saying, the common discourse of a rabbi was to be reverenced as much as the law. To dispute with one or to murmur against him was a crime as great as to do the same toward the Almighty. Their words must be received as words of the living God. In other words, the interpretations of the rabbis and their passing on these oral traditions was considered to be infallible. Does that sound familiar? Now, in the teachings of the rabbis, they were considered practically infallible. And I want to read from Geikie once again, where he states this very fact. He says in his book, once again, The Life and Words of Christ, it was a principle universally accepted that the sayings of the scribes were weightier than those of the law. And the word law, it's not talking about the Ten Commandments, it's talking about the writings of Moses, the Torah. He continues explaining the transmission, notice the key word, transmission, of the as yet unwritten opinions of former rabbis, forming an ever-growing mass of tradition, was the special aim of the rabbis of each age. Once uttered, a rabbi's words remained law forever. Unchangeable and infallible, in other words. So, once uttered, a rabbi's words remained law forever, though they might be explained away and virtually ignored while affected to be followed. So in other words, people would give the impression that they were following them, but there were all kinds of ways in which they could escape obeying them, while at the same time saying that they were obeying them. And we're going to know this in our next lecture. It's very interesting. Now, the role of the teaching office went far beyond explaining and applying the writings of Moses, even the oral revelation that had been passed along. The rabbis frequently brought forth religious practices and beliefs which were not implicitly and much less explicitly contained in the written revelation. When the rabbis did this, were they claiming that they were bringing a new truth that had not been previously revealed? Not at all. They taught that these truths were part of the deposit of unwritten traditions which God had given to Moses. They believed that though these traditions had not previously been brought to light or written, they had been preserved in the process of oral transmission. And they were merely discovering these gems of truth from the oral tradition that had been passed along from generation to generation. You start to catch the view that in Roman Catholicism, the way that all of these practices that are anti-biblical and contrary to the Bible are justified. It's because of the Roman Catholics' view of tradition. Now, this brings us to the issue of authority. The Pharisees believed that only an elite cadre of carefully trained theological experts, guided by God, could bring to light, explain, interpret, and apply the written scriptures as well as the unwritten traditions. In other words, the common populace could not really understand the scriptures or the oral tradition. They had to have theological experts. They had to have theologians that could tell them this is the meaning of the written text and this is an oral tradition that was passed along which wasn't written, but we're taking it out of the deposit of oral tradition. Now, the Jerome Bible Commentary, which is a Roman Catholic Bible commentary, interestingly enough, had this to say about the word cathedra in Matthew 23, verse 2. You know, there Jesus said that the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Have you ever read that statement there? The scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Now, what does that mean, that they sit on Moses' seat? Well, we need to know what the word is. The word seat there is the word cathedra. That's an interesting word. In other words, the scribes and the Pharisees sat on Moses' cathedra. And you say, why is that significant? Well, it's significant because the Roman Catholicism has an interesting way of describing the teachings of the Pope when he speaks with absolute and complete authority. Do you know how they say that he speaks? He speaks ex cathedra. In other words, the word cathedra means throne. So when he speaks from the throne, his teachings are absolutely infallible, is the idea. And that's the very word that is used here for the scribes and Pharisees sitting on the cathedra of Moses, on Moses' seat. Now notice how the Jerome Bible Commentary, which is a Roman Catholic commentary, explains the idea of the cathedra. The phrase is most probably a metaphor for the authority of the scribes to what? To teach. In other words, because they sat, it wasn't, by the way, it wasn't a literal seat. You know, like in the Roman Catholic Church, you know, the Pope, it's not, cathedra doesn't mean that he's sitting on a throne. What it means is that he has authority to teach because he's the king of the church. In other words, he rules the church. And so it says the phrase is most probably a metaphor for the authority of the scribes to teach. In rabbinical tradition, the interpretation of the law was carried on in a scribal tradition that theoretically went back through an unbroken chain of scribes to Moses. And then the Roman Catholic commentary says, this view is, of course, entirely unhistorical. So it's unhistorical when it applies to the Jews, but it's not unhistorical when it applies to the Roman Catholic Church. Now, when the Pharisees and the scribes spoke ex cathedra, that is from the throne, their word was to be accepted as final. The general populace was required to accept these rabbinical views and interpretations and obey them without any question. Thus, the genuine meaning of both the written word as well as the unwritten traditions were only to be determined by the rabbis, and the general populace had nothing to say about the matter. George Foot Moore, once again in volume 1 of his work, pages 40 and 41, explains how the theological experts had a stranglehold on the information that the people were required to accept and to believe. This is what he says. Learning is the privilege of leisure. Husbandmen and artisans are the support of the social structure. But wholly occupied as they must be in their several callings, and often highly expert in them, they have no time for the wide-ranging studies that make the scholar. They are therefore not qualified to be called to the council or to take the lead in the assembly. They cannot sit on the judge's bench, for they do not understand the principles of the law and cannot bring out the rights of the case and a just judgment. Different is the case of the man who gives his whole mind to it and concentrates his thought on the law of the Most High. He will seek out the wisdom of all the ancients and occupy himself with the study of the prophecies and pay attention to the expositions of famous men, and will penetrate into the elusive turns of parables. He will search out the hidden meaning of proverbs and will be versed in the enigmas of parables. Do you remember our study last night? Interesting. In other words, the experts are the ones that can understand Scripture. They are the interpreters. The theologians are. The common people, you know, they have their jobs. They're not able to understand Scripture for themselves. And so they must accept the interpretations that are given by the theologians who quote other theologians. In this way, the religious leaders had absolute control over every person and sphere of private and public life. Whoever questioned the opinion or authority of the rabbis was in danger of being cast out of the synagogue. As we can see from the story of the man that was born blind. You remember that his parents, they said, ask him, because they were afraid that they were going to be thrown out of the synagogue. Now, Jesus, in Matthew 23 and verse 13, had something to say about the scribes and the Pharisees. He said, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in." Now, how did they do this? How did the scribes and the Pharisees shut the heavens so that people could not go in? They wouldn't go in themselves, and so that other people could not go in. Luke 11:52 has the answer to that question. Luke 11, verse 52 says that they had taken away the key of knowledge. You see, they believed that they had the key to unlock the Scriptures. Common people did not have any right to do that. They had to accept the interpretations, so to speak, of the church and of the theologians. It says there in Luke 11, verse 52, "Woe to you, lawyers." And by the way, this is not lawyers like we understand them today. These are experts in the law of Moses. These are religious lawyers. So woe to you, lawyers, for you have taken away the key of knowledge. You did not enter in yourselves, and those who were entering in you hindered. And so the religious leaders had a stranglehold upon the common populace. And the rebuke of Jesus against the scribes and the Pharisees was very, very strong. In fact, in Matthew 23, Ellen White says that he was trying to break this stranglehold so that people would study the Scriptures for themselves and not accept the mere interpretations of the so-called experts and theologians.